Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our fascinating series on the history of Muslims and Islam across the globe. I'm joined by Dr. Akbar Ahmed, who needs no introduction. Dr. Ahmed is a professor. He is a former diplomat. He is, a man of letters. I mean, in short, he's a Renaissance man. And given his the breadth of his knowledge and research and scholarship, uh, we have been trying to get as much out as as possible in a limited period of time. And today we will be talking about the Muslims and their histories, myriad set of histories in Europe, and how the different cultures and civilizations interacted, clashed, and evolved into the present day Europe. And we'll come to that later because there's a whole centuries long relationship. And that is what we want to explore today, Dr. Ahmed. Um, Maybe you can start with the origins. I mean, how Muslims have been seen for centuries in European politics, in their literature, in their arts, and or quote unquote, as Gandhi said, the idea of of a European civilization. How is it viewed then? I think that's where we start, Dr. Ahmed. Over to you.
Thank you, Raza. You're right. It's a very complex relationship that is between Muslims and Europe. Europe, as you know, is a fascinating continent which has great fans and admirers, including, say, Winston Churchill, who called it the mighty, the noble continent, but also the turbulent continent. Remember, this is where the two world wars were fought and 100 million people died. So it is a continent of great consequence, and we are, from the Muslim world, very much tied to it. So how do they see the Muslim world and Muslims? Starts with the first big invasion of the Muslims from North Africa, and this is with Tariq, the great general who crosses from Gibraltar into Spain, and very quickly the Andalusian region of Spain becomes Muslim very quickly. And Tariq wins battle after battle. And of course, as you know, Gibraltar, Jabal Tariq is named after him as a memory of his presence in that part of Spain. Now, so I would say the first view of Muslims is a positive one, because this civilization that comes from North Africa and the Arab world, because Abdul Rahman will appear very soon, he's an Umayyad, this perception of the Muslims is of a civilization that is bringing books and libraries and art and architecture, and the people of Spain see these marvelous buildings, the Grand Mosque in Cordoba, the palaces in Granada. They've seen nothing like this. There's really art and beauty and grandeur. And the Spanish are so influenced that the Arabic language is mined for Spanish words. So even today, I was shocked to hear that something like 30,000 words in Spanish are borrowed from the Arabic. And from here, of course, as you know, they come to North America, South America. So you'll see towns in the Americas called Medina or Fatima. These are words coming from Islamic culture. So this is the first phase. Most important, this phase of Islam gives the concept of la convivencia. That is, let us coexist. You have your religion, as the Quran says, I have my religion. Let us live together, thrive together. This is a very important concept that comes to Europe. And not only Muslims, Christians pick up this concept. So you have the Spanish king based in Toledo, Alfonso X. He actually says his work is all in Arabic or Spanish, and he says, I am the king of the three faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's incredible, this kind of synthesis and inclusivity. Then you have Roger II in Sicily, who so admires Muslims that his advisor, Al-Idrisi, famous Muslim name, a scientist, Roger would not sit on his throne until Idrisi sat on his chair, just out of respect. And then, of course, you had the great Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was a remarkable man, remarkable man. He spoke Arabic. He had Muslims in his bodyguard. His mantle, his imperial mantle, had Arabic in it. And if even today, if you go to Sicily, to the Palatine Chapel, which Roger II built, you look up at the ceiling and there's Arabic in it. There's Arabic and there's the Kalma and so on. So there was a huge impact on Spain, on Europe, on Italy, on Sicily, of the Muslim presence. So positive. This is the first phase. And in a sense, I would say this was seen as the superior civilization, a civilization that is producing philosophers, scientists, the first man to try flight and so on. Now, this phase begins to end in 1236, when Cordoba, the capital of this beautiful Muslim empire, falls. Because in the meantime, the northern Christians are beginning to unite and beginning to reconquer, and they call it the Reconquista, the lands lost to the Muslims. So 1236, Cordoba falls. It's a very significant loss for the Muslims. And then in 1492, Granada falls. And when Granada falls, there's a very dramatic sequence. The ruler of Granada, the Muslim ruler, comes down from the palace in Granada, and he's on the bridge. And he pauses and looks back, and he sees the beautiful palace against the skyline. There's the snow-covered mountains at the back. And he begins to cry. He's so moved. And his mother says the immortal words. She says, "You're crying like a woman, what you could not defend like a man." And that's it. That's the end of the Muslim rule in Spain. And the church now and the King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella, they unite to wipe out the peninsula of all Muslims and Jews. Both Jews and Muslims are now expelled. And it's a terrible expulsion. It's not a comfortable or easy expulsion, which it never is. For example, if you were forced to leave Spain, you had to leave behind. You had to leave behind your children. So the children would grow up as Christians. Now, this is a very severe punishment. I don't think we've seen a punishment of this scale even in this very cruel 21st century. So, but this is exactly what the Muslims face. So this is the end of the first phase of Muslims in Europe. The second phase, which almost simultaneously has begun from the east, is the arrival of the Ottomans. Now, the Ottomans arrived like a thunderbolt in Europe. And that image of the Ottomans as rapacious, aggressive, predatory will be imprinted in the minds of Europe right up to our time today. So the idea of the Turk, as the English literature would often portray them as the terrible Turk, that remained in the minds of Europeans and has become a stereotype, a trope. So even today, when these refugees arrive from different parts of the Muslim world, at the borders of Eastern European countries, these European rulers and dictators will say, these are Turks. The Turks are coming back. And of course, they're nothing like that. They're very impoverished people escaping the chaos of home. So this is the second period of the Ottomans. The Ottomans are there as a mighty empire. And as we know, that they had the courage, the gall, the imagination to attack Vienna twice. Just think of a Muslim power so arrogant and so lost in its own sense of might that it's attacking Vienna, which is one of the major cities of Europe. This is what they did, and Suleiman the Magnificent takes the Ottomans to a completely new height. Now, in this phase, the image of Islam is replaced from that of a civilized, cultured civilization to that of a brutal, powerful civilization which must be fought and fought to the death. So when the Ottoman Empire begins to decline, and it's called the sick man of Europe, you'll see that many Europeans arriving in Eastern Europe to support local rebellions against the Ottomans. You know the famous poems of Lord Byron and so on about the Turks and fighting from supporting the Greeks against the Turks. And in the 19th century, these countries along the eastern part of Europe begin to gain independence. And in the end, we have the First World War and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and by 1922, the end of the Ottoman Empire. So this is the second phase. Of course, in the meantime, the Ottomans have given a brilliant illustration of what they can do. We know about the military might, we know about the architecture, about those magnificent buildings which still exist in what was once the Ottoman Empire. What we don't know, Raza, is that they also believed very strongly in the law. So they called it Kanun, which, as you know, means the law. And Suleiman, particularly Suleiman the Magnificent, established the rule of law. So it developed, again, very advanced compared to what was happening in the rest of Europe. And then we come to the third category. So you've got the first phase, the second phase, the Ottomans, and the third phase. It's useful to categorize so we can easily get into the European mind talking about Muslims. The third phase I would call the immigrants, and that is the contemporary phase. So now Europe is seeing a very different side of Islam. They're seeing Muslims as impoverished, miserable, running away from the chaos of their homes, the corruption, the dictatorships, escaping with their lives, desperately climbing onto those very frail boats and rubber dinghies, crossing the Mediterranean, dying en route, and those really very tragic stories of little children, 7-year-old, 10-year-old little kids washed on the shores because no one cares. No one cares because that is the nature of this 21st century. Except, and I must point this out, this is another very European example of humanity, the Pope, again, in Rome, the Pope who arrives at one of the islands receives these same refugees who are treated with such contempt by local officials, and he washes the feet of the refugees. And that, of course, he's echoing what Jesus Christ would do to people in this very sorry state of affairs. So this third phase has created a lot of controversy in Europe and has generated severe Islamophobia. So a lot of politicians have risen on the basis of the hatred against the refugees. The argument that these refugees have come, they're taking our job, they're increasing the rents for the buildings and housing here. They are violent, they're involved in all kinds of violent acts against our local people, molesting our women and so on. So that becomes a kind of trope against the Muslim community. And you'll see that in Holland, in France, all the right wing, Le Pen and so on, they have emerged stronger and stronger. If you correlate it, it's with the immigrants arriving in Europe. And then, of course, when the Germans allowed almost 1 million refugees to arrive in Germany, which is a huge number because the populations of European countries is not very high. And suddenly you have 1 million people, 1 million people from a different culture, speaking a different language with a different outlook, a different dress, different appearance. It makes a huge impact, and that fed into the right wing in Germany, which today is on the ascendant. So you have all these complex interplays of Muslims in Europe. But for me, Raza, I think the greatest gift of Europe, and it was based right from my childhood, almost like a young man. When I arrived for the first time in Europe in the 60s as an undergraduate, one of the first things I did when we got the summer vacation, I saved whatever pocket money I had. Like all undergrads, I was broke. And I actually hitchhiked from England, hitchhiked across Europe and into Andalusia. And it was like a magical country because at that stage, interestingly enough, Spain wasn't very developed. Remember, it's early 60s, before the European Union, before the economic takeoff. So the trains were still, you had passengers coming on board with a goat or chickens in their hands and the fruit basket, taking it to the market. The train would suddenly stop at some point. They would pull the chain. So it was very much a very rural, backward society. And Andalusia, I went to Granada, I went to the great mosque in Cordoba, and I drank it all in like someone who was intoxicated because these were legendary memories of a past that had gone. And I called it the Andalusian syndrome. So that when you look at, if you go to visit Hyderabad, Deccan in India, and you'll see a civilization that was very rich and contributed in art, in culture, and the caliber of people it produced, and which has gone. So it creates a sense of nostalgia, a sense of sorrow, a sense of pride in what was accomplished. And I found this Andalusian syndrome in so many people across the world. One of the people I interviewed for my book, Journey into Europe, which is where I was recently traveling over several years, and I produced a book and a film. I talked to Prince Turki, who heads now one of the major research centers in Saudi Arabia. And I asked him, I was able to catch him in the Ditchley conference in Oxford. And he was very open, very accessible. And I said, what does the loss of Andalusia mean to you? And his answer moved me. He said, it is literally like someone cutting off my right hand. So there was a great sense of nostalgia because the Arabs felt very proud that they had created that civilization. This is the first category, the Arabs and the North Africans. And we in South Asia, we're always very romantic about Muslim history, and we obviously associate with that. So this Andalusian syndrome, to me, becomes something not just in the past, but something that haunts Muslims even today.
That is indeed a great overview, Dr. Ahmed, and I certainly would like to pick on that. I mean, you talk about how the Muslim civilization, if I may call it that, declined, and you saw its remnants, and alongside how the European prejudices in the started germinating and expanding, and then we come to the modern day. But before we do that, I mean, the Ottomans obviously had a major influence. I mean, I was in Venice a few weeks ago, and even in Venice, you could see the signs of Islamic architecture, the arches, some of the buildings, the traders had traveled, and you see all those signs. But despite that, I mean, there's also been an erasure. I think we have explored this subject earlier as well, that there's a deliberate erasure of this past, this Muslim past. Either it's, frowned upon, as you said, the Turk phobia, it's looked down upon. So, Dr. Ahmed, tell us how much were the Ottomans a threat to what we understand as Europe today?
Raza, I would say, again, I have to be realistic as a scholar. I can't take sides. I must base my response to you on history and on facts and evidence. The Turks were an imperial power. There's no question about that. They were out as a powerful empire, acquiring territory. So they were expanding into North Africa, the Middle East, right down to Yemen, into East Europe. And territory meant wealth, it meant power. And for that, they were very, I would say, even brutal. They would pick up young boys from Christian countries, Christian lands, and enter them into their armies and then train them as young Muslims. So that also created a sort of ambiguity, because these young boys would grow up into men who would then become the biggest champions and supporters and warriors for the Ottomans. But at the same time, it created, as you can imagine, a great deal of ambiguity in Christian lands. So the Ottomans, with their presence in Europe, created this sense of a predatory force, and Islam was then equated to this predatory force. And when you mention the erasure of the Muslim past, you're absolutely right, because we discussed this earlier. Ibn Firnas in Andalusia, who attempts flight, and if you ask most people, especially in the West, very, very few people would even know his name, and that the fact that he was the first person to attempt flight, because commonly they'll say it's Leonardo da Vinci or the Wright brothers in America. So you're absolutely right that there is a challenge here, because Muslim history is a bit like the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland. It begins to fade away. And it's up to the intellectuals and the scholars and the artists, Raza, like you, to keep that tradition alive, or very soon it'll just fade away. And again, as a scholar and being very neutral about it, very, very neutral and analytic about it. This is how societies behave. They would promote themselves, they promote their own achievements and ignore that of others. This is exactly how societies behave. That is why I think it's imperative for Muslims to know a little bit about their own history and their own culture. And in Europe, as I pointed out, you have a very rich and a very dramatic trajectory. So that even today, when you talk of Europe and racists, and now racism has been unleashed, when the racists talk about Muslims as a worthless civilization, there's so much to point out. But if you know about it and if you're able to feel that argument, you have a very strong case. And I'll tell you one thing. I've given you examples of Christian rulers like Alfonso X, of Roger II, Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. You know, someone like King Charles in England, he's in that mold. He is reaching out to all his subjects. He constantly says, Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, they're all part of my community, my subjects, my people. So there is that tradition, and Muslims need to build on that. And we have. You'll see the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. You'll see the First Minister in Scotland, Hamza Yusuf. So there is a great impact, and dozens of lords and members of parliament. At the same time, for a lot of ordinary people, there is a challenge. And let me quote, Raza, I think this will be interesting for the viewers. Let me quote the chief rabbi of Denmark on this very issue, because I asked him, I said, Chief Rabbi, how do you see it? What advice would you have to give to the Muslims of Europe? Where do you think we should be putting our effort? And he said, let me give you a response based on my experience with my community, the Jewish community. He said, it's a small community, the Jewish community of Denmark, and he's the legendary chief rabbi. And he said, number one, he said three things. Number one, when we first arrived a few centuries ago, there were virtually no Jews in Denmark. So we set up schools. And these schools were not meant to teach Judaism, but these schools were set up so we could learn about Danish, about Danish culture, the Danish language, Danish history. And he gave an example. He said, now the leading Danish writer is from our community. The second point he made was that yes, the minority has rights, and the minority must be recognized and its rights recognized. But the majority also has its rights. The majority has its history and its compulsions and its demands, and we must take that into account. We can't just dismiss it and say, think of us. And thirdly, he said, the reality is that if one Jewish person does something wrong, he breaks the law, he's caught violating something, they will blame all the Jewish community. And he said, your community right now is going through that. So if there's some act of violence, if some community, ISIS or someone does some violence somewhere else in the world, people, all Muslims are violent. And I thought that was very good advice, Raza, because Muslims very often don't see their problems in the context of larger society. Very often they'll see them in their own context. I myself, when I was at Cambridge in the 90s, very often I used to be in the media, and I remember very often coming back to my college and picking up my mail from the Porter's Lodge. And I'd find that sometimes people would write and say nice things, but sometimes I'd get very often an anonymous note where someone would have scribbled, "Go home, you black bastard." And I just smile. I'd say, this is part of the game. This is, as you say, when you're in the kitchen, you have to face a bit of heat. And that was what the heat was.
Right, right. Okay. So, Dr. Ahmed, the Ottoman Empire disintegrates. And of course, that happens early 20th century after the First World War. And then we see sort of, by now the European colonial power is firmly in place. The Brits have their own territories, the Germans, the Italians, etc., etc. And then there are the next 20, 30 years, very, right up to 1940s, the time of turbulence, what is happening in Europe, the rise of fascism leading to the Second World War. And then we see another, colonial intervention when the Middle East is broken into parts arbitrarily, partitioned into modern countries. Where sometimes they were not even natural borders. I mean, they were just created for colonial convenience and balance of power. And so, talk about this phase. How were the Muslims treated by European powers? Because this particular time period in the first half of the 20th century is now haunting us even today. Take the issue of Palestine, take the issue of Iraq, Iran, the Kurds, etc., etc. So let's go into some detail there.
Raza, you're absolutely right. And you pointed out something which is very, very important in understanding history, not just Muslim history, but history. You're absolutely right that in the 19th century, what you saw was the phenomenon of the rise of the colonial powers. Now, it's an incredibly complex situation because these colonial powers knew Muslim lands. For example, the English had come to Mughal India. It's a different relationship. And if you see the paintings from that time, the English were very obsequious. They're bowing like this and bowing their head to the Mughal emperor and so on. Slowly over time, these same communities, that is the English, took over and in time began to dominate India, and then removed the emperor from Delhi, took over power, and actually then ruled on behalf of the crown. So suddenly you have European powers dominating and colonizing Muslim lands. And there, I'm afraid, all colonization is nothing but brutality. So while they brought some advantage, there's an argument that they gave us the language, European language, and so on. The fact is that they sucked those lands dry of their economic wealth, and most important, they devastated the local lands in terms of their confidence, their self-confidence. So the argument was made, and it had to be made to justify colonial rule, that your rulers, for example, in India, the British argued that all Mughals, the Muslim rulers of the last dynasty, were all corrupt and rapists and murderers and worthless people. They just dismissed them. There were caricatures in most histories. So that became part of an argument to justify their own rule. Now, I'm sorry to say that strategy has, in a sense, been carried on by the critics of Muslims even today. So the impact, you're completely right, that the impact of the colonial era on Muslim land, just like we were under the British, the French, for example, were in Algeria. And if you look at the history of the Algerians under the French, they had a terrible time. For them to get independence meant that they had to physically fight for it. And in the end, there were literally millions, hundreds of thousands of Algerians who were killed, brutally tortured, killed, raped, in order to gain independence. So colonialism is, I would say, a curse on local people. And we should all be aware of it, because romanticizing it simply means that you are putting it aside from your screen, the radar screen. And we have to confront it, condemn it, and move on. But moving on is very important. So your next generation should be aware of the past, but then be able to move on. And there are now, as you know, Raza, millions of Muslims living in the West, millions living in Europe, some of them doing very well, but the future is there. So they have to be able to speak the local language under very difficult circumstances, establish their families, and contribute to their society so that they can grow and thrive as citizens of that land.
Yes, Dr. Ahmed, absolutely. I mean, that is something that the Muslims ought to be also thinking about, as you said, moving on. But the problem is that some of these legacies continue. So like in modern day France, the Algerians, the way they are treated, in the French jails, a large number of prison population. In fact, I was reading that almost half of the prison population is the Muslims, and the Turks in Germany. Now, these are the big groups. I'm just trying to
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And the South Asian Muslims and the African Muslims in the UK. And then, of course, you have a smaller populations in Scandinavia, but the level of hatred or suspicion is disproportionate. So, I mean, and this recently, the Netherlands and I mean, this political party has been actually arguing on the plank of anti-Muslim rhetoric. Now, before we go to that, I just want to say that, these European governments and states, how far do you think they have reckoned with and reconciled and sort of, tried to address their brutal past vis-a-vis Muslims?
I think, Raza, you're absolutely right. And this is a very important discussion. And as I did this project on Europe precisely to try to find out the reality for myself, I found two things. One, that they do not fully recognize the brutality in the past. So very often they'll romanticize the colonial era and simply look at what they think are the positives. We gave you cricket, we gave you the railway line and so on. And of course, as we know, the railway line was meant to move European troops from one point to the other, not to help local people. At the same time, I also found, and this is a reality, that these countries that you're talking about quite deliberately exploit the public sentiment against the immigrants. And there they focus on Muslims because Muslims are, in a sense, more easily recognizable, easily identifiable, and their acts of violence very often associated with Muslims. So they use this community for political purposes, which means that you'll have Le Pen in France, or and the right-wing leaders in Holland, even Denmark, where we were in Denmark, using the immigrants, using Muslims, and saying, oh, these Muslims treat their women very badly. They're basically misogynist. They're backward people. They don't believe in democracy. They don't believe in progress. And unfortunately, Raza, we have to again link this with what's happening in the Muslim world. So it's not very easy to be able to convince people that there is something worthwhile. That is why I firmly believe that you have to switch the argument to the past tense, because Muslims have contributed, they're capable of contributing, and they will contribute, but they need to, first of all, I think psychologically, remove the shackles of colonialism. And colonialism is a very dangerous, insidious disease, I would say, because it's left an impact on Muslim societies over the last 2 centuries. It hasn't gone, and it comes in the form of racism, it comes in the form of prejudice about the color you have, or the background you have, or the schooling you have. All these leave an imprint. So that I find that there are Muslims now in the West who are changing their names. There are Muslims who are changing their religion. Because when a community is under this extreme pressure, it begins to respond this way. And remember, they're coming out of that colonial encounter. So the colonial encounter, which we thought ended in the 40s, you mentioned the 1940s, in fact, is still with us in different forms. It may be in different forms, but it's still there. And I think some of the great leaders that we had in South Asia, for example, Quaid-e-Azam or Mahatma Gandhi, or these leaders, they were precisely challenging and standing up to the colonial presence. They were saying, we are capable of arguing with you and capable of gaining our independence within the law. We are not going to be breaking the law as such, and we're not going to be promoting violence, and we will be proud of our own culture. We want to maintain and secure our own culture.
Right. Dr. Ahmed, that takes us to the present day. Now, your book and your documentaries that you made, Journeying into Europe, where you speak to so many Muslim communities and non-Muslim communities and Jewish and Christian people and the governments. So let's come to the present day. And I think that is something, because we have talked about the history and how it is shaping and informing or maybe haunting the present too. So what were the key sort of findings of your grand, massive project with regard to, you've already laid out some of that, but in terms of, let's say, the Muslims in the 21st century Europe, and you said racism and other colonial legacies still befuddle and, challenge their integration as equal citizens. So, what are the kind of challenges and roadblocks, impediments that you found? So, share those with us, and then we can talk a bit about the way forward.
Raza, again, on the travels through Europe, I was determined to talk to the ordinary Europeans, so taxi drivers, students, whoever I could get hold of, conduct questionnaires, take interviews, but also talk to the spiritual leaders of Europe. So we interviewed the Archbishop of Canterbury, the chief rabbis, not only in one country, in several countries, the grand muftis of Bosnia, very wise Muslim leaders, very wise, very learned, who would say we are European, we are Muslim, we are proud to be Muslim, but we are European, and who themselves are under a huge shadow. They said this, they said that Europe would never allow another Muslim country to exist, and that's why we almost faced extermination. So these issues that we are discussing for a lot of European Muslims are live issues. Now, what did I find? I found that the most important step that is needed to come out of this very convoluted and complex relationship between Muslims and Europe is to understand each other through the big ideas that we are discussing. For example, the notion of la convivencia, that the idea of coexistence, not to tolerate each other, but to embrace each other and understand each other's culture. Now, I was surprised very often in a lecture. Let me give you the example. I arrived in Copenhagen and I was invited to speak at the main university. And I found people had not heard of this concept. Literally, so it was something new. So we have to constantly share our knowledge. That's one. Number two, not be discouraged, because you'll have to face some backlash, some Islamophobia. Someone may be insulting, someone may say something nasty about you, but you're on a mission of peace, of humanity, and you have to show a certain amount of resilience and courage. That's number two. Number three, we are living in the age of the media, Raza, and this is where you are doing such marvelous work. You're living in the age of the media, of television, of interviews like this that we are conducting, your Friday Times that you're editing, the books you're writing. It's critical that this is amplified so that people know about these discussions and are able to be encouraged, because people need to be also encouraged that there is hope, there's something positive. And that's what really keeps me alive in a rather gloomy environment, when you have this constant sniping at Muslims or Islam, or constant sniping. And I myself have been a victim of some of these Islamophobic tropes here. There are several centers which just promote Islamophobia constantly, and they target anyone they think is prominent. So you have to just take it and smile and move on. One of the most ridiculous attacks on me, Raza, I know it'll amuse you, was that Akbar Ahmed is a supporter of the terrorists, and in support of that argument, they said because he is a great admirer of Rumi, and Rumi, as we know, was a terrorist poet. Now, I was so shocked at the ignorance of that statement. If you're calling Rumi a terrorist poem, Rumi, the poet of love, of mystic love, of embracing the whole universe, it shows how much work we have to do. Not back down, but continue in the spirit of promoting understanding and promoting love and compassion.
Totally, Dr. Akbar Ahmed, and that's why your works are of such immense significance, because they try to light some candles in this, uh, environment of darkness, because there's ignorance, there's historical prejudice, there's the whole colonial baggage, and then there's, of course, the modern day, the colonization's transmutation into racist ideologies. But on the way forward, I mean, of course, other than education, enlightenment, the role of media, which I think is a big problem. Western media is singularly, if you look at it, and there have been many studies. It's not my assertion. There's a wide range of scholarship saying how media portrays their negative portrayals of Muslims reinforce biases and Islamophobia. But I think you already alluded earlier on what Muslims need to do, because you see, the other problem here is, and this is my argument, that the Muslim majority countries also create a lot of bad, press for the Muslims that live in in the West. So whatever happens in, let's say, Jakarta in Indonesia, or in Pakistan, or in the Middle East, or elsewhere, then it has a, in this global age of fast information, digital travel, age, uh, this has even a bigger impact. So I think the Muslims also need to do a bit of introspection, both those who
So we have
live
to
in
be
the,
very sensitive. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely, absolutely, and not be so sensitive, because I know that in Pakistan, for example, if you are critical or self-analytic or just looking at your own society with the intention to improve it, and you say something critical, people will jump on you and say, "Oh, you're anti-Pakistan, you're anti-Turkish, or you're anti-Iranian." Muslims have to remember their own tradition. They produce scholars and writers and poets who've been very analytic and self-critical. So there's nothing wrong with that. You're doing it out of love for your community and society. So I agree with you. We have to be much more rigorous in our thinking about ourselves, because that impact on the West feeds into the idea that there's something wrong with Islam. The new argument of the Islamophobes is that it's not the Muslims to blame. There's something inherently wrong with Islam, and therefore Islam is the problem. Now, this is and then they make up things about Islam which are just not true, and yet this is what they're promoting. Now, who's going to challenge that, Raza, if it isn't people like you, the intellectual leaders of the community? And that is something that I'm afraid that you have to face, because I know that at one stage your life was in danger, and still you have to carry on with that work. And that is how I think society moves ahead, flourishes, and eventually takes everyone along with it.
correct. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for your kind words. You've put a lot of burden on me for the ummah. I'm just one little cog in the big machine. But anyway, this has been a fascinating conversation as always, and I'm so grateful that we are talking about these issues and laying this long, complex history in these short videos. I hope that the viewers learn from it, and that their feedback would be welcome. Their questions and comments, please feel free to leave them so that we can get back to you as and when required. With that, we shall come back with another episode, and goodbye for now.